Welcome to Modern Minds. I'm Mark Henick. This is our last episode, so I think it's fitting that we talk about radical recovery. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Javeed Sukhera from the Institute of Living at Hartford Healthcare, and Dr. Ahmed Hankir as well. He has a new book out, Breakthrough, a story of hope, resilience, and mental health recovery. So let's start there. I'm going to introduce you now to Dr. Ahmed Hankir, and here's the conversation that we had. Dr. Ahmed Hankir, thank you so much for joining us on Modern Minds today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's great to join you.
Now, you have a new book out. It's called Breakthrough, a story of hope, resilience, and mental health recovery. This isn't your typical, it's not your typical tome by another psychiatrist. You're kind of balancing two worlds here, right? You're an award-winning psychiatrist on the one hand, a mental health advocate, but you also self-identify as a former psychiatric patient as well. So I'm wondering if maybe, can we start by taking us through a little bit of the story that you trace in your new book?
Absolutely. Yes. So I think a good starting point would be when I developed an insight into my mental state. So I call it the insight switch, and allow me to elaborate. So for a very long time, I was in denial that I was suffering with my mental health. And I think the factors that contributed to that denial are the stigma and the shame. And I'll never forget one morning I woke up in a dilapidated and squalid terrace house in Manchester in England, and the insight switch suddenly turned on. And I was overwhelmed with the realization of how much damage had been done, seemingly beyond repair. And I don't care if this shatters my masculine bravado, because I'm determined to rewrite the narrative and what it means to be a strong man, a strong person, and expressing our emotions and seeking help is a signs of strength. And so I will share that I cried inconsolably. And that was when I was at rock bottom. And it was the darkest and loneliest period in my life. And I eventually sought informal support initially from my imam in my local masjid, in my local mosque, because I'm a practicing Muslim. And he comforted me and he consoled me, but he urged me to seek professional help from a psychiatrist, which is what I did. And slowly but surely, I recovered and I resumed medical school with a renewed determination and resilience, Mark. So there's a lot more that happened, which I detail in my book Breakthrough. But yeah, I think a good starting point would be when the insight switch suddenly turned on, because the mind mounts these defense mechanisms. One of them is denial. I think it's important also to comment on how initially I perceived it, or as I framed it rather, as a breakdown. But I was able to make meaning out of my experiences, and I was able to reframe it as a breakthrough. Hence the title of the book, Breakthrough.
There's so much in this, the process of a breakthrough, because it's so fundamental to the idea of recovery, right? And I
Mm.
wonder though, in my experience of recovery from my own mental illness, it was much more a slow, cumulative process with lots of backsliding. And so I'm
Yeah,
wondering about that then. I know that I didn't have this kind of hallelujah, sudden turnaround kind of moment. Do you know it
yeah.
when you're in it, when you're having that insight, or is that a retrospective thing?
I mean, it was a slow, gradual, and painful process, recovery. And it was non-linear in the sense that it wasn't just like, like a straight line. It was convoluted, that recovery journey. And sometimes you would take one step forward and two steps backwards, right? And I think for a long time I was in recovery, and I would say that I have recovered. now I'm able to function, for example. But I still get traumatic flashbacks. But to go back to what you were saying, I think there was some insight. I wouldn't say that I had full insight into my mental state and where I was in my recovery journey. Because, I mean, denial is it's just so powerful. And you live with the shame as well, which contributes to the denial. And to be honest with you, I think I'm still processing the traumatic experiences. And it's been like what, over almost 2 decades now since I was rock bottom in Manchester in England. So maybe even in a way, I'm still in recovery. It's a process. It's a process, Mark.
Hmm. I'm wondering about that end point of recovery, and there's at least two different schools of thought around this. Some people think that you're always in maintenance therapy of some sort, that you'll always have this mental illness and you're always just keeping it at bay.
Mm.
There's another school of thought, I think, which is that if you no longer meet any of the diagnostic criteria for the illness anymore, then you don't have the illness anymore. Where do you fall on that? Is this something that
Now,
you're always in maintenance, or can we fully recover from these sorts of experiences?
I mean, I approach mental health, mental wellness, mental illness from dual perspectives of provider as a psychiatrist and receiver as a person who was once a psychiatric patient. And the terms psychiatrists use are like relapse, right, or remission, right? I'm in remission. I don't meet the diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder, right? But I prefer a more humanistic or humane framework, and
Mhm.
I wouldn't use those terms in my capacity as a survivor or as a person living with a mental health condition. I once used that term, I have lived experience, but when you use lived, it's as if it's confined to the past, and it's not. I'm living with a mental health condition. I'm not even taking it a day at a time, I'm taking it a moment at a time. Um, because I'm still vulnerable to these mental health wobbles. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm unable to function. But
Mm.
I guess I'm trying to illustrate the point that I'm living with a mental health condition and it's not behind me, and I have to be vigilant. Like, for example, I went for a 20-kilometer run this morning. What inspired me to do that? Because I know that if I don't, my mental health will deteriorate.
Mm.
So I
Mhm.
hope I was able to uh, explain what I mean by living with a mental health condition, even though I'm functioning.
Yeah,
I
very
would say
much
it's
so.
relatively high level. Yeah.
It's curious what you mentioned about remission, because we don't say that people are in remission from influenza when they're in between flus.
Yeah.
That it might come back. It very well might come back. So, what does resilience mean to you in that sense? Are you able to make yourself more protected against those sorts of, if it's a relapse or a recurrence of a
Mm.
mental health problem again? Do you think you're more resilient now than you were before?
It's an important question. Thank you for asking it. I would definitely say I'm more resilient because I think I'm more insightful and I know what my early warning signs are or what my relapse indicators are. And I mean, a succinct definition of resilience is that ability to bounce back, right? And cliche though it may be, I think it's true. What doesn't kill you doesn't make you stronger. And I am a firm believer in post traumatic growth. And so you remind me of this award winning documentary. His name is Stephen Fry. We call him a national treasure in the UK. And he lives with bipolar affective disorder. And he was interviewing people who also live with bipolar affective disorder. And he asked them if they could press a button and rid themselves of their bipolar affective disorder, would they? And all of them said they wouldn't. Now, I know that's like if it was a study, it would be fraught with limitations because it was a small sample size. I think he only interviewed like 7 people. But the point is that I think I am more resilient because of my mental health experiences. So, in response to your question, I'm not only more resilient, I think I'm more insightful, I think I'm more empathetic, and I think I'm more driven, not despite my mental health experiences, but because of my mental health experiences. So, yeah, I don't think I would press that button.
We'll be right back with more from Dr. Ahmed Hankir in just a moment. But first, I want you to hear from Dr. Javeed Sukhera. Javeed is the chief of psychiatry down at the Institute of Living at Hartford Healthcare, for whom this whole podcast wouldn't be possible without him. So let's hear a little bit from my conversation with Dr. Sukhera, and then we'll revisit the rest of the conversation with Dr. Hankir right after that. So here's my chat with Dr. Sukhera. Dr. Sukhera, thank you for coming back on Modern Minds.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Well, we're talking about radical recovery today, and this is a concept that you've been championing at the Institute for Living at Hartford Healthcare. So why don't we start there? Talk to us about what exactly radical recovery is.
So the Institute of Living is a very interesting place where pioneers in mental health care in the country and in the continent. 200 years ago, we were founded with the simple idea that people who are suffering deserve humane and dignified care. But what we know at this cross section in history is that the way in which we're delivering mental health is, it's not working well enough. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain. We really need to take a radical shift towards the future. So radical recovery is the narrative that we've stitched together to describe 3 main things that we need to consider. The first is the topic or the idea of co-design. Too much of mental health care as we know it has been designed by systems, by people who work in those systems, and not enough attention has been given to authentic partnership with people who might be struggling or suffering within those systems. Now, we've made great gains in patient partnership, patient engagement, increasing peer support, which is all good and things we need to continue. But what we're suggesting is that it's not just about increasing peer support. It's about recognizing that all of us have lived and living experience, and that therefore co-design should be inclusive of the power that people might feel or have in the system and the vulnerability or the experiences of vulnerability that all people working within and outside of the system can tap into. It's only by working together, co-designing care, co-designing the goalposts of what good care looks like, that we can shift the paradigm towards something that's much more transformative. The second is choice. I think many of us will acknowledge that in many ways, traditional psychiatric care has normalized a lot of coercive practices. Now, those might be formal, things like restraint, seclusion, involuntary hospitalization. But there are many ways in which choice gets taken away from people in the current system. In order to change that, we really need to be much more intentional about creating opportunities for choice and ending the normalization of coercive practices. And this is something that we can do at all points of connection through a healthcare system, but it really requires intentionality. And then the third is the idea of community. Far too often, we expect individuals to heal on their own. What that's led us to is a system that really fosters coping instead of a system that really allows for healing to take place. And we know that nobody heals alone. We all heal with each other and through community. So for us to move forward, we need to embrace the healing power of community, the communities that organizations like ours serve, but also ourselves as a collective, as a community of healers. So those 3 C's for us are a sort of roadmap, a narrative, a framework to reimagine the way we do mental health.
So I want to unpack each of these a little bit further: co-design, choice, and community. The co-design piece is particularly interesting for me. As a person with lived experience, I talk about my own experience all the time. What does that actually look like in practice? You know, I think in the lived experience community, people have kind of become a little jaded, I think, by just being the token person with lived experience on the committee or on the board or whatever. I know I've felt that way. So what does that actually look like in practice?
So I think that tokenization has been sort of the norm in a lot of the engagement efforts that are taking place. And what I see that as representing is this kind of dichotomization that there's experience on one end of the continuum and expertise on the other, and that somehow they can't coexist with each other. And I think that's highly problematic. So for us, what that looks like is definitely creating infrastructure for more meaningful engagement. And an example of that is we've developed a participatory process for policy co-design. So every time a policy in our system comes up or we need to write a new policy, we post that publicly. We want people to give us input on the language we should use. We want the people who really should be served by that policy to be informing how we write it and how we evaluate it. But it doesn't stop there. Part of the problem with dichotomization is that it erases the idea, like I said, that experience and expertise can coexist. And with that, I'll invoke my own personal example. So I would also consider myself an individual with lived and living experience. I'm not at the point in my life that I really feel comfortable sharing all of the details about that. But I want to highlight that by being a leader in the health system and the mental health system, I am also someone of lived and living experience. And that is something that I should be able to leverage to inform not only the decisions that I make as a leader, but to bring some of that vulnerability into the spaces in which we provide care. So co-design gets extended from something maybe two-dimensional to something four-dimensional, where it's not just about co-designing with one another, it's co-designing from some of the most vulnerable and humane parts of our own selves.
The idea of choice as well, I think, is closely related to this because, you know, part of, and we've talked on this show a number of times before, part of the mental health care system is very paternalistic. We're the experts, we know best for you, and you have to follow our lead. However, we also know that there's many different routes to recovery, that people recover in all sorts of sometimes weird and unexpected and wonderful ways. So is that part of the choice equation here is offering people more options that may not necessarily be in narrow silos of service?
Absolutely. And I think it's really just about respect and empathy. We have to really shift towards the idea that our safety, for those of us who work in the system or live in communities, is inextricably intertwined with the safety of people who might be suffering. I think that there's far too much zero sum thinking that suggests that control and choice, are really like a pie, and one thing has to only exist at the expense of the other. Every single one of us, if we imagine ourselves in our most vulnerable moment where we're seeking help, we're seeking care, that means that sometimes we might want someone to maybe make a choice for us, or we might look to or seek someone to help support our own choices. The main point for us in changing the system by foregrounding choice is really being attuned to how precious and fragile choice can be and how easily and slippery the slope is down sort of a coercive pathway. We take for granted that people who might be struggling or suffering should and must have the unalienable right to have a say, then we fall into a very tricky and dangerous slope of losing trust and potential harm. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't and might not be circumstances in which things might look a little bit different, but it boils down to the people in the system and the people served by the system working together to really foster a maximum amount of dignity, respect, and autonomy.
Now, I think community views of mental health have evolved considerably since the Institute of Living was founded. I mean, you were radical to use that word at the time. So, what does that look like in terms of both integrating care into the community, but also the other way around, inviting the community into care? How do you make this a more how do you make mental health care a more communal experience?
Well, I think that what we have to realize for those of us working in systems like ours is that mental health and healing is already a fundamentally communal experience. And that maybe we need to rethink the way that we do it. We've built institutions, organizations with high levels of expertise and infrastructure, and we expect everybody to come to us. In some cases, we expect people to drop what they're doing in the middle of the workday, come to us, maybe pay for parking, maybe wait. And that's sort of the way that it feels normal. Embracing the healing power of community requires us to recognize that people are already healing in their communities, that there are many communities that contain a legacy of knowledge and practices and wisdom that we need to be better at honoring and protecting. There are many young people I've worked with who always say, why is it that I feel like I have to be at my worst in order to access care or access help? So I think we need to turn things a bit upside down. If we want to embrace the healing power of community, we need to be deferential to the communities, the diverse, complex, and varied communities that exist in the areas in which all of us work. And that means not just, not doing anything and leaving it to them, but it means through humility, seeking their partnership and asking them, what do you need from us? How can we come out to you? How can we share, spread, and reinvest these resources and expertise into supporting people healing in their own communities?
Mm. I want to come back to that word radical again because it's one of my favorite words. It's one of my favorite, practices as an advocate, as somebody who's been outspoken on this. Um, Radicalism, not in the extremist sense, but in the bucking tradition sense, uh, invariably has resistors, detractors, people who are very comfortable with and maybe benefit from the old order or the existing status quo. How do we negotiate that change out of a very sort of crystallized structure of old knowledge to something else, something different, like what you're proposing?
So I think that's a deep question, and there's ways in which to think about that really provide lessons for change management in general. Now, we chose the term radical intentionally and strategically. We wanted it to be a bit provocative. We wanted it to disrupt a sense of what feels like it could be comfortable or normal. But what I would argue is that fostering radical change requires holding disruption in one hand and dialogue in the other. Change is not easy. And yes, there might be resistance for people who explicitly want to preserve a status quo that advantages them. But there's also a lot of resistance from anybody who might be doing something, working hard, pouring their heart and soul and emotional labor into a way of being that they genuinely believe can be helpful. So if all of a sudden we come and say, well, we need a radically different way of approaching things, that can feel very invalidating. One of the ways we're tackling that is that we've created actually a dialogue group, a group that meets monthly to grapple with what it means to feel invalidated or challenged as we advance this radical work. It allows us to actually create a sense of shared experiences, of shared community, but it's an intentional creation and holding of a space to acknowledge that change is difficult and that any disruption has to be accompanied with healthy and constructive dialogue if you want to build something as you work to dismantle other aspects of what you're trying to change.
I know that you do a lot of work in medical education. So, hearing you speak, I'm curious about how the training of new psychiatrists, but mental health professionals in general, um, has changed since either you were trained as a doctor or since your maybe traditional understanding of what it means to be a psychiatrist. Has that already been experiencing the type of sea change gradually over the years that we're talking about right here?
So I'd say the answer is yes and no. A lot of my research looks at not just medical education, but other health professions. Recently, I did a study looking at how three different educational sort of paradigms have difficult conversations. We looked at medical education, nursing education, and we looked at teacher education. And something we realized is that in health professions like medicine and nursing, we tend to have a hard time not being the experts. For example, nursing educators would look for outside experts if there's a topic that they didn't feel they had expertise in. Whereas medical educators are so used to being the experts in everything, when they encountered a topic that they didn't have expertise in, they were just so flustered and didn't even know what to do. So I definitely think that medical education, psychiatry education, has a long way to go. We've made substantive gains in learning how to work and collaborate in teams and think in diverse ways. But I think that we need to push ourselves even further, embrace different ways of seeing and knowing. And there's ways in which we're going to hopefully do more of that within our own training programs, such as incorporating peer support workers into our formal curriculum, having opportunities to discuss and grapple with the role of power and coercion that play or influence how psychiatry is practiced. And I think that there needs to be much more experimentation and creativity in how we train one another.
Mm. Now, I want to bring this back to the service user, the person with lived experience, the patient. We've accumulated a lot of labels and have changed the nomenclature over the years, but um, I'm wondering who this concept of radical recovery really applies to. Is recovery available to anybody?
So I think that's a great example of what's different about this idea. We would traditionally think that a new idea, a new approach to mental health care would really only apply to the person who's suffering, right? The person who's seeking care. But this concept of radical recovery is unique in that it actually intentionally applies to the healer and the person who might need healing because it shatters the illusion that there's any separation. And it embraces the idea that all of us, whether we're working in a system or seeking care from a system, are all just as vulnerable to being either healers or people who might need healing. And by acknowledging that very human part of all of the people that interact with one another, we allow for the co-creation of something that's fundamentally different, that gets to the deeper heart of the way that care needs to be, rather than sort of the same old um, dyad of two people.
Where do you think people recover best? I mean, I know you head up a psychiatric hospital, and that's an important part of the system. Um, but there's a lot of different places where people can recover. So where do you think that the meat of recovery really happens?
I think all of it depends on each individual case. There are many people who might need and benefit from recovering in a high acuity inpatient setting. And there are many lives that are saved and transformed through the right kind of treatment that might be at that end of the continuum. Others might benefit from intensive outpatient programs or traditional outpatient programs. And then there's a lot of people that heal on their own or with peers or with family or through diverse and sort of varied things that work for them. I think what we, working in traditional hospital, medical, psychiatric settings, need to do better at respecting is that, there is no one pathway to healing, and healing doesn't occur in a straight line. rather than try to look at things as a one size fits all. We need to be able to co-create healing spaces and work better with partners that might be in community-based or non-traditional settings, to be able to create a network, community of healers that's sort of interconnected rather than in competition with one another.
Mm. And I mean, I asked that last question, and it's a bit, admittedly, a little bit leading, because I'm wondering, when people present to hospital, for example, or even just go and talk to their doctor on an outpatient basis, chances are there's something that they're struggling with. And when you're at the peak of the struggle, you can maybe speak to the clinical side of this, but just from my own personal experience, when you're at the peak of the struggle, that's not always the most effective time to practice your recovery skills. It's really when you present like you don't need any help, that you can do some of that work most effectively. So I'm asking you about the sort of points of care because I'm wondering how we fill the gaps. How do we bridge the silos that exist in our care system in order to make recovery more seamless?
Well, I'll give you a couple of tangible sort of examples of things we're trying to do, because I do think that a lot of what I'm sharing might sound like platitudes and buzzwords, and I really want to bring it back to like a basic practical, bottom line. So one example is engagement with family. A lot of health systems, I'm a child psychiatrist, so I engage with families, that's what I do. But a lot of health systems, when someone turns 18, don't actually engage families in a meaningful way. So that's something we are being very deliberate about. Now, what that doesn't mean is that we force people to engage with families that might have harmed them, or that we don't respect an individual's choices. It's that we recognize that whoever might be coming into like a high acuity inpatient setting, they are going to go home. Their chances of being healthy and actualizing their potential and thriving are higher if they have people, if there are people in their corner. And that part of our job in mental health care and mental health care services should be to help engage that person with and engage ourselves with, to a degree, those people who are part of that person's community, rather than exclusively just looking or seeing them as an individual. So I definitely think that there are examples of how we need to have this frame shift and think about how we design and build systems. And I think that that's just the example I gave is just the tip of the iceberg.
We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Dr. Ahmed Hankir right after this.
Mental health is health. At the Institute of Living, we are pioneers in mental health, and we have been for 200 years. We have an ambition to transform mental health services while co-designing these services with those whom we serve. Together, we can reduce stigma, address discrimination, and increase access to care.
I know that the world can be a dark and lonely place, right? And when you were at the throes of a major depressive disorder, you learn many lessons. One of them is that you don't ever, if you are fortunate and blessed enough to recover, one of the important lessons is you don't ever want to be in that dark and lonely place again. And so you'll do everything that you can. And with mental illness or a mental disorder or a mental health condition, whatever term you prefer, certainly with me, I would say to myself, it can never happen to me. Initially, I would say, it's something that happens to other people. It doesn't happen to me. But if you look at the statistics, for example, the World Health Organization, you may have come across this before. One in four of us at some point may develop a mental health condition, right? So it's not only possible, it's probable. And so I know that I'm not invincible. It might be that I have internalized that public perception that doctors, physicians are invincible. But the reality is that I am a human being and that I'm fallible and that I am vulnerable to developing a mental health problem. And so that was one of the important lessons that I learned from my major depressive disorder, that I need to be proactive and I need to be in the front foot as opposed to being reactive and on the back foot. And again, this might even be cliche, but prevention is better than cure, right? Prevention is better than intervention. So if I'm going through a tough time, then I know what I need to do to protect my mental health and prevent myself from becoming unwell again.
Mm. You said something interesting that I want to pick up on. Um,
Sure.
if you're fortunate and blessed to recover, I think
Yeah.
that's interesting because is recovery a matter of luck? Or is it a matter of science? Is it an art or a science? You know, you see what I'm getting at? Like, is it only the
Yeah,
lucky few who get there, or can we increase the hit rate?
I wouldn't say the lucky few. I think recovery is a reality for the many and not for the few. But I don't want to be accused of being culpable of toxic positivity. We have to be realistic. And tragically, persons living with a severe mental illness, for example, bipolar affective disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, I can't sit down here and say to you, everyone will recover. No, that's not the reality. That's not true. And it is heartbreaking. And I often say that a government is judged based on how we treat the most vulnerable in our societies. And if you look at how we treat persons living with a severe mental illness, governments have failed spectacularly. So not enough is being done. I think more resources need to be allocated for the provision of mental health care services, for example. Um, but unfortunately, no, not everyone can recover. But recovery is a reality for the many and not for the few. Now, I think recovery is a science to I guess, a degree, and we have recovery scientists. But in UFT, this is when I first came across this term, which really appealed to me. There are recovery artists, and so you can argue that recovery is as much an art as it is a science. But because of my beliefs, I mean, I would attribute my recovery to divine intervention. I think it was a miracle. It was miraculous. But that's because of my religious beliefs. So maybe we need art, we need science, and we need divine intervention to recover.
There's a very active conversation in psychiatry now, it seems, and I'm sure you've seen it. Anybody who's spent any amount of time on Twitter or X has
Yeah.
probably seen this debate around a sort of biopsychosocial model, or even axing out the bio part completely around social determinants of health, and especially in the UK, versus a more biomedical kind of approach. You
Mm.
know, what pathway do you think holds the most promise, or maybe it's multiple? To be the right route to recovery?
I think we need to be holistic and we need to have an individualized approach. What works for one person may not work for someone else. Even what works for you at one point in your life might not work for you at another point in your life. And it's unfortunate because it almost feels like there's polarization. There are like two camps, right? There are people who are like pro psychiatric drugs, pro psychotropic medication. These mental health medications saved my life. And there are persons who are like, oh my God, I hate psychiatric drugs. Psychiatric drugs destroyed my life. Psychiatric drugs almost killed me. And it seems like there's a lot of enmity between the two camps. And I don't think that's helpful. And I mean, I've been honest, open, and transparent about my mental health experiences. I was prescribed psychiatric drugs. They didn't help me. They were harmful for me. But just because they were harmful for me at that point in my life, that specific drug, it doesn't mean that it's harmful for other persons. And I mean, in the same way that insulin has side effects. Chemotherapy has side effects. Psychiatric drugs have side effects. It really does depend on the individual. So I'm not anti psychiatric drugs. I'm anti prescribing powerful psychiatric drugs when it's not necessary. I think there's a lot we can do before we get our prescription pad out. So I'm actually a proponent of non-pharmacological approaches, lifestyle interventions, exercise, physical activity, diet. We know that there's a relationship between gut health and brain health, the gut-brain axis. All of these things. Therapy. Oh my God. I mean, therapy can literally be life-saving. So to reiterate, we need to have a holistic approach. We need to be individualized in our approach to mental health. And there is a biopsychosocial model, but to quote my colleague and my friend at the World Health Organization, Dr. Michelle Funk, she prefers psychosocial bio model because look at like you said, the social determinants driving mental illness, poverty, unemployment, accommodation, insecurity. All of these things contribute to our mental health, our mental wellness, and can be factors that contribute to developing a mental illness.
And I believe it was a while ago now, but I think in the UK, didn't they relatively recently update NICE guidelines such that you're supposed to try therapy first before going to medical interventions? Is that true?
Yeah. I think, depending on the severity of your symptoms, if you have a major depressive disorder with psychotic symptoms, if you are floridly psychotic, then no. But if it's like, if it's like a mild to moderate, you're absolutely right. Put your prescription pad away and modify your lifestyle. If you can, don't get me wrong. I'm extremely blessed and fortunate to be able to engage in physical activity. I understand there are persons who want to, who dream about being able to exercise, but they can't through no fault of their own. So that's something that I can't take for granted. But no, absolutely. I know I'm repeating myself, but repetition is emphasis. And I think it's important for me to labor the point. There's a lot that we can do before we get our prescription pads out. And as you rightly said, the NICE guidelines in the UK recommends that you consider therapy for mild to moderate major depressive disorder, for example.
Now, you mentioned a couple of times, the differences between something like psychosis or bipolar disorder versus other illnesses and anxiety, depression. I feel like in some ways, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, the mental health awareness movement has become very popular. It's become very celebrity endorsed in many ways. It's on media all the time. I think something has been lost, though. A certain sophistication has been lost in that popularization, in that it seems like mental illness is just talked about in the singular, like it's one thing. That person has mental illness. But hearing you speak, there's a lot of diversity there. There was a recent study which suggested that placebo response rate is wildly different depending on whether you have depression or anxiety or psychosis or bipolar disorder. So can you talk a little bit more about that sort of diversity of diagnoses within the broad spectrum that are mental illnesses?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it can be treated like it's a monolithic entity, but it isn't. It's heterogeneous, isn't it? And you can argue like there's a spectrum, and you might have a common mental disorder. The symptoms might be less severe. They might be mild, for example, and you can still function. But you can have like a condition like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or bipolar affective disorder. You can be manic, for example. And, by definition, unfortunately, often it necessitates psychiatric admission because you are a risk to yourself, and not only to yourself, but to others as well, because you're not in control. When you are floridly manic or floridly psychotic, you're not in control, unfortunately, through no fault of your own. And I think persons living with a severe mental illness are excluded from that mental health conversation, that mental health discourse, to their detriment. And I think it's important not to conflate a, a, a common mental disorder, the symptoms of which can be mild, with a severe mental illness, the symptoms of which can be, by definition, severe. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of nuance, and you have to be careful and cautious for sure. And also, it takes a mental health care professional to be able to make that formal psychiatric diagnosis. Because I think there's a lot of people now, they're starting to self-diagnose, and that's concerning, to say the least.
Mm. I'm interested in that process because I think, there's different phases as a person with lived experience. And I haven't read any research on this, but I think there's different phases of acceptance and relationship to those diagnostic labels. It seems like very early on, you need a label, some sort of label to describe what it is you're feeling. You need something to call it, to categorize it. But then later, sometimes people will accumulate diagnoses. They'll have long lists of them. Sometimes that doesn't even make sense because the symptoms overlap. So, can you talk a little bit about the art of diagnosis and how it can sometimes evolve and change as the illness does?
Well, I think it very much depends on the individual. And one of the questions I often ask is, do you identify as, for example, neurodivergent? Or do you accept that you have received this psychiatric diagnosis? I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan of psychiatric diagnoses for myself. And I mean, I can't remember the last time I used a psychiatric diagnosis for myself, but it really does depend on the individual. I mean, it can be helpful when, for example, you're applying for benefits. And so to reiterate, it can be helpful because we know that persons living with a mental health condition, again through no fault of their own, can have difficulty functioning and securing a job, for example. So they do need that social and financial support. So I get that, but also it can be very stigmatizing as well. Uh, for example, borderline personality disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder or first episode psychosis. These are all psychiatric diagnoses that are associated with a huge amount of stigma. So it can be helpful, it can be harmful. It depends on the individual and what their preferences are. But I think the most important thing is to never forget that you are treating a human being, and we need to dignify the person receiving care from us and respect their preferences and their wishes and their autonomy as best as we can.
When you're in the depth of that pit, when you're at that rock bottom, everything that we're talking about right now is kind of the furthest thing from your mind. It feels like you have
Oh, yeah.
this way of blocking out, all this hopefulness and
Oh,
different
yeah.
avenues, and that's a function of the experience, right? I mean, that's almost the definition in some ways of a mental health problem is this rigidity that sets in around you. So, all that goes to say, would you 20 years ago, when you were at your rock bottom, have believed you now if you now were your psychiatrist then, would you believe all this stuff about hope and recovery and treatment and that you could have a better life?
This is why I love being interviewed by persons who have lived experiences, because I don't think a psychiatrist would have asked me that question. And it's a question that I ask myself sometimes, and even when I'm giving my talks and my lectures, I say to my audiences, if you would have said to me 20 years ago that I would be here giving you this lecture, or if, for example, I remember when I was really fortunate to receive an award. I was a mental health hero. And this was in front of whatever politicians. King Charles, he delivered a speech and he presented an award for a person who, I think she was Doctor of the Year, but I was the mental health hero of the year. But the point I'm making is, I said to my audience that if you said to me back then that I would be here receiving this award, I would never have believed you. Actually, you, I would have been offended because I think you would have been joking. Because like I said, and I can't emphasize this enough, I would never have believed you. And so I think it's important, especially as a mental health care professional, as a mental health care provider, to know that often the person receiving care from you has lost all hope, and they do succumb to despair. And we need to plant the seeds of hope into the hearts, minds, bodies, and souls of persons receiving care from us. And also, never ever take hope away from someone, because often hope is all they have left.
Now, you're a practicing psychiatrist now. Do you see your former self in your patients, and
Oh, no.
how do you
Mm.
communicate that hope to them when they're in that dark place?
It's interesting because only recently I was providing care to a patient, and it felt like there was like a kindred spirit between us. And he's very creative, and I think he's a playwright. And his mother came with him, and they were so grateful, especially the mother, when, because I don't often share, but I think they did Google me, which is not uncommon. And so they heard about me and my book Breakthrough, and they were aware that I'm honest, open, and transparent about my mental health experiences. But just by saying to the person receiving care from me, look, don't give up hope. You know, you're not alone, and together we can get through this. We can beat this. And yeah, I do see myself in the person receiving care. I mean, it was really interesting because he loves that film Blade Runner. And we started reenacting that scene together. I'm like, oh my God, you know that film? You know that famous scene, that soliloquy, that monologue? I have seen things you people wouldn't believe. And that was really like, if it wasn't, it was cathartic. That was cathartic for myself, but also for the person receiving care from me. But I also have to be careful because I know it's very unique. It's subjective, isn't it? So there might be universality in the sense that I know what it's like to succumb to despair because that person was feeling hopeless. I know what pathos is. I know what it's like to punish myself and to say to myself that I am not worthy of compassion and that I am not worthy of love and I don't deserve to get that again. So, I mean, I know those feelings, but to reiterate, I have to be very careful because it's unique, isn't it? It's subjective. So I need to be mindful of that.
Mm. But I know that sharing your story, at least, even if you don't see these people sitting across from you, it helps to advance that message even further. That radical recovery, that hope, is
Yeah,
accessible to more people than maybe currently even realize.
very much so, very much so. But also, it's something to be ashamed about, and to say that with conviction. I am a physician, I am a psychiatrist, I am a person living with a mental health condition, and that's nothing to be ashamed about. And saying that with conviction, I think that can literally be life saving and help to prevent suicide.
Dr. Ahmed Hankir, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Your book, Breakthrough, A Story of Hope, Resilience, and Mental Health Recovery, that's available everywhere now, right?
It is absolutely, I think, in Canada, the popular bookstore, if I'm not mistaken, is it Chapters and Indigo? But yeah, it's available to purchase online as well if you just go to Amazon.com. And of course, your support is very much appreciated.
Thanks again, Ahmed.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much for joining us this month on Modern Minds. As I mentioned, it is our last episode, so I think it's so important that we talked about this concept of radical recovery with two such compassionate and brilliant experts as Dr. Javeed Sukhera and Dr. Ahmed Hankir. I hope that you found this whole conversation not only informative about what recovery is, but inspiring as well. Whether you're a clinician, inspiring recovery in the clients and the people with lived experience that you work with, or if you're a person yourself who is struggling to navigate this system, to navigate your own mind, I hope this inspired some hope in you. And remember, there's lots of overlap between those two categories of people as well, that helpers sometimes need help too. Now, I hope that you go back and check out some of our other conversations that we've had over the course of the season of Modern Minds. We've talked about deprescribing. We've talked about back to school. Today was recovery, architecture, teen mental health. We had so many interesting conversations with cutting edge thinkers in this space. Every single episode is available in both audio and video on Spotify and YouTube. So follow the show on either of those platforms to get notified as soon as they're put up, and occasionally when we put up updates to them as well, like extended content. We also have audio-only episodes on all of the usual podcast platforms: Apple, Amazon, Audible, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. So if you have ideas for future conversations that we might be able to revisit on this show, get in touch with me on social, or just let me know what you think about this one. Tell me your recovery story. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Threads, X, YouTube, at Mark Henick. That's MarkHenick. Or you can also contact me through my website, markhenick.com. I look forward to talking with you more again in the future. So until then, I've been Mark Henick, and this has been Modern Minds.